In the year 2022, Russia, with its vast 17 million square kilometer landmass, had its sights set on Ukrainian territory. This was not a new development, as in 2014, Russian forces under the command of Putin entered Crimea and took control of Donetsk and Luhansk regions with the help of separatists. This move by Russia, which acted as a border between Western Europe and Russia, caused alarm in Western Europe. Despite the economic sanctions imposed by the Eurozone and the United States on Russia, conflicts continued to occur until 2021. In February 2021, the Russian Defense Ministry announced that it had deployed 3,000 paratroopers to the Ukrainian border for large-scale exercises after a long hiatus. This move caused concern in Europe, and under the leadership of NATO, 27 countries and 30,000 soldiers participated in the largest military exercise in the past 30 years. Putin was aware that this exercise was aimed at him. In response, in March 2021, approximately 40,000 Russian troops were deployed to the Ukrainian border, including Belarus, Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk. The situation escalated quickly, and in April, Ukrainian President Zelensky announced his intention to take back Crimea. The next day, Russia sent additional 10,000 troops to the Ukrainian border, and 15 warships stationed in the Caspian Sea were shifted to the Black Sea and placed near the Ukrainian shores. In May, the Russian army and separatist militias in Ukraine conducted a large-scale military exercise on the eastern border of Ukraine. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense announced that the number of Russian troops stationed on the border had reached 80,000 in May, 90,000 in September, and 110,000 in November. These troop buildups were the biggest indicator that Vladimir Putin was planning to invade Ukraine. As 2022 began, Russia began to evacuate embassy personnel, starting with Kiev, and the number of Russian troops on the border reached 127,000. Short-range ballistic missile systems were deployed near the border, capable of hitting the capital, Kiev. On February 10, Russia staged the largest naval exercise in history, involving 140 ships, 60 aircraft, and 10,000 military personnel in the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, and the northeastern Atlantic, openly demonstrating its military power to the world. Ukraine, on the other hand, had been preparing for a possible Russian invasion. Since April 2021, 25,000 soldiers have been deployed to the Donbas region to counter the threat. The army began training soldiers in urban warfare and guerrilla tactics, with NATO member countries, especially the United States, providing 290 tons of ammunition and $9 million in financial aid. Despite these efforts, fighting resumed between separatists in Donbas region and the Ukrainian army on February 17, 2022. Just 4 days later, on February 21, Putin formally recognized the independence of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics and ordered the Russian army to enter Donbas under the pretext of peacekeeping. This move by Putin marked the beginning of a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which resulted in a long and bloody conflict with devastating consequences. On February 24th at 1 a.m., Ukrainian President Zelensky declared a state of emergency and mobilized the army's reserve forces. However, just 3 hours after this announcement, a series of explosions rocked eastern Ukrainian cities, including Kiev and Kharkiv, as Russian forces swiftly and simultaneously attacked from 4 different directions. Troops from Belarus moved towards Kiev. Troops from the northeast moved towards Kharkiv, troops from Luhansk and Donetsk moved westward, and troops from Crimea moved northward. Russian troops advancing southward from the Dnieper River aimed to encircle Kiev from the east and west and quickly reach the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. When Russian forces fired on the nuclear plant, a high alarm state was declared around 7 a.m. and in the morning around 2 p.m. a conflict broke out between a small number of Ukrainian soldiers and Russian soldiers stationed at the plant. By the end of the day, Russian forces had taken control of Chernobyl and Pripyat, holding approximately 300 personnel hostage. Measurements taken after the end of the conflict revealed a 20-fold increase in radiation levels at Chernobyl. The Russian forces continued their advance, and by the early hours of February 25th, they had reached the Hostomel airport north of Kiev, which was of great importance to them as a supply point. Attacking the airport, which was defended by Ukrainian People's Defense Forces, the Russians engaged in a 6-hour battle around noon and eventually gained control of the airport in the evening. In the east, Russian forces laid siege to Chernihiv Oblast on February 24th and quickly took control of the city the following day. Another Russian unit crossed the border and began moving towards Konotop, which they captured on the morning of February 26th. The Russian forces then began advancing towards Sumy Oblast in the afternoon, but the defense of Sumy was stronger than in other areas, and the Russian forces trying to enter the city lost over 100 vehicles and 68 soldiers in just 3 hours. Russian attempts to capture Sumy continued until the beginning of April, but the Ukrainian defenses held firm and the Russian forces were forced to withdraw from Sumy on April 6th. Returning to the west bank of the Dnieper in the night of February 26th, Russian jets flying over Kiev began bombing strategic defense zones, but one Russian plane was shot down by the Ukrainian forces. Despite the sound of gunfire throughout the night, the Russian soldiers were unable to enter the capital city of Kiev and ended their attacks in the morning. The first Kiev attack resulted in the loss of 60 Russian soldiers and 12 Ukrainian soldiers in combat. On the morning of February 26th, Russian artillery bombarded Kiev for about an hour. Despite Ukrainian President Zelensky's announcement that Russian forces had approached within 31 kilometers of the city center, the Ukrainian army was able to hold them off, and Kiev remained under Ukrainian control. However, on the morning of February 27th, Russian bombers flew in from Belarus and indiscriminately bombed the city, causing significant casualties. In response, Zelensky called on the people of Kiev to resist the Russian forces and ordered the distribution of weapons, ammunition, and grenades to 50,000 residents. On February 28th, a convoy of about 2,000 armored vehicles from Belarus formed a 64-kilometer-long convoy and began moving southward to surround Kiev. However, the convoy was stopped at a distance of 39 kilometers from the city due to ongoing clashes. The following day, the Russian Defense Ministry issued evacuation notice for all civilians in Kiev and the surrounding area. Later that night, both the Russian artillery and air forces launched a massive attack that lasted until morning, resulting in deaths of many Ukrainian civilians and soldiers, and the downing of 2 Russian planes. On March 2nd, the Russian army began to besiege the city with the intention of creating a blockade. As the Russian convoy approached Kiev, the Ukrainian army established 2 defense circles, one inside and one outside the city. American President Biden offered to help evacuate Zelensky from Kiev, but Zelensky rejected the offer, saying that sending ammunition was more important than leaving the city. From March 4th to 7th, intense fighting occurred around Kiev, resulting in deaths of 23 Russian soldiers and 7 Ukrainian soldiers, as well as the downing of 2 Russian fighter jets. The Russian advance was halted for the second time due to logistic issues faced by the Russian army. During this time, Russian and Ukrainian officials established a temporary humanitarian corridor around Kiev and evacuated approximately 2 million residents by March 10th. On March 11th, Russian forces launched a heavy attack on the Sviatoshinsky, Podilsky, and Osokorki areas, but were unable to hold their positions and were forced to retreat. Fighting continued until March 21st, with Russian forces attempting to take control of the city and Ukrainian forces defending it at all costs. However, the Russian army was exhausted, facing logistic issues, and unable to capture Kiev within the 2 days they had predicted, leading to a decline in morale. On the morning of March 22nd, the Russian army launched a counterattack to completely drive the Russians out of the city. The fighting continued until March 28, by which time the Russian forces, whose supplies were running low, were forced to retreat to a position 45 kilometers north of Kiev. On March 29, the Russian Defense Ministry announced that its troops would be withdrawn from the Kiev region, and by April 2nd, all Russian forces had completely withdrawn to Belarus. On April 2nd, President Zelensky announced that the Ukrainian army had regained full control of Kiev. As for the city of Kharkiv, which is just as important as Kiev, Russian forces gathered in Belgorod on February 24th, engaging in clashes with Ukrainian forces throughout the day. At 4 a.m. the next day, the Russians began to besiege Kharkiv from the north and the east. In midday hours, Russian troops, along with the artillery support, entered the city but faced fierce resistance from Ukrainian soldiers, leading to street battles. As the 2nd Russian Brigade entered the city center, fighting spread throughout Kharkiv. After 1 day of intense fighting, the Russians suffered heavy losses and withdrew on the morning of February 28th. The Ukrainian army regained control of the city and hundreds of Russian soldiers surrendered. Russian planes indiscriminately bombed Kharkiv, cutting off electricity, gas, and water connections, turning the city into a ghost town. On March 1st, a short-range missile fired from Russian territory destroyed the city center, killing almost 80 civilians. Following the bombing, Russian paratroopers landed in Kharkiv, leading to another round of intense street fighting. The Ukrainian forces, who had received guerrilla warfare training prior to invasion, successfully cornered and captured 200 Russian soldiers and a colonel who had run out of ammunition after 2 days of fighting. On March 8th, after the city was fully retaken, more than 600,000 civilians were evacuated. The fighting gradually moved out of the city, ultimately resulting in the withdrawal of Russian troops from the outskirts of Kharkiv by March 20th. However, Russian airplanes continued to bomb the city almost every day, resulting in the deaths of dozens of civilians. In May, the Ukrainian army launched a counterattack to push back Russian forces towards the international border. The Russian troops began to retreat after the Ukrainian Air Force carried out intensive bombing in the region. Eventually, on May 13th, Russian forces were pushed back to within 3 kilometers of international border. In this attack, 2,850 Russian soldiers were killed, and 86 tanks, 158 armored vehicles, and 106 artillery systems were destroyed. Despite being close to the Russian border, the Russian army didn't face logistic problems and made intense efforts not to retreat from Ukrainian territories. However, with the start of September, the Russian Defense Ministry realized they could not win and decided to withdraw completely from the Kharkiv front. On the southern front, Russian forces began their offensive on February 24th and quickly took control of North Crimean Canal. Berdyansk was occupied on February 25th, followed by Melitopol and its surroundings on February 26th, due to insufficient defense by the Ukrainian army. Russian forces surrounded Mariupol with reinforcements from the sea, but their first attack was unsuccessful, and they were forced to retreat. On the evening of February 27th, the Russian Navy launched amphibious operation on the Azov Sea coast, 70 kilometers west of Mariupol, in an attempt to capture the city. On March 2nd, Russian troops entered the city center of Kherson, making it the first major city to be captured on the southern front. Kherson was strategically crucial in capturing Mykolaiv, which was the main target. Despite launching a major attack on Mykolaiv on March 4th, the successful Ukrainian defense pushed the Russians back to Kherson within 2 hours. Dozens of missiles fired from Navy ships turned Mykolaiv and Mariupol into a war zone, resulting in the loss of approximately 2,500 civilian and Ukrainian soldiers' lives. After Russian soldiers reached the city center of Mariupol on March 18th, street battles prevented civilian evacuations. On March 20th, a school in Mariupol was destroyed by Russian bombs, killing all 40 people taking shelter inside. Despite Russian calls for Ukrainian soldiers to surrender following fierce fighting, the response was negative, and it appeared that the fighting in the city center would continue for a long time. With forces from the Kiev front being shifted to the southern front on April 2nd, Russian attacks on Mariupol resumed after a long period. As of May 22nd, Russian forces intensified their attacks in Luhansk and Donetsk, advancing towards Sviatodonetsk, the largest city under Ukrainian control in Luhansk. On May 23rd, Svetlodarsk fell to the Russians, and Liman followed on May 26th. On June 3rd, Russian forces reached Sviatodonetsk, and the Ukrainian Defense Ministry ordered soldiers to evacuate the city. As the evacuation order was given, the troops began to break the siege, and on June 24th, they completely vacated the city. With the entry of Russian soldiers into the city, control of Luhansk region completely passed to the Russians. Turning to the southern front, in early August 2022, Russian attempts to enter Mykolaiv were repelled multiple times due to the fierce defense of Ukrainian forces. On August 29th, President Zelensky announced a counterattack to regain the occupied territories in the south. At the beginning of the operation, Ukrainian planes attacked a military unit used as a garrison by the Russians in the Kherson region. Subsequently, ground forces recaptured several settlements north of Kherson from the Russians. On August 30th, Russia deployed numerous troops and equipment to the Kherson front to resist the Ukrainian attack. Meanwhile, Ukraine intensified its airstrikes against Russian gathering points, ammunition depots, bridges, and other targets. To slow down the advancing Ukrainian forces, the Russians destroyed bridges over the Dnipro River, but this tactic worked against them, as the destruction of the bridges greatly hindered the Russian supply line, making it difficult for their troops to hold the city. Due to the continued attacks in October, Ukrainian forces approached within 3 kilometers of the city center, and the Ukrainian army was on the verge of entering Kherson. On November 9th, the Russian army, which had lost over 3,000 soldiers in the ongoing conflicts since August, announced its withdrawal from Kherson. On November 11th, Ukrainian forces entered Kherson, lowering the Russian flag and raising the Ukrainian flag for the first time in 8 months. Almost simultaneously, with the withdrawal of Russian troops from the outer neighborhoods of Kharkiv, the entire city of Kharkiv came under Ukrainian control. Thus, the Ukrainians had retaken all regions that had fallen into the hands of Russian forces in the west since the beginning of Russia-Ukrainian war in February 2022. From November 2022 to February 2023, the war continued on the Luhansk and Donetsk fronts, resulting in minor border changes. This was the cause of the conflicts and border changes during the first year of the Russia-Ukraine war. Hopefully, this war will come to an end soon, and we will not have to produce the second part of this video. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.